Hello and welcome to the Just Culture Spotlight webinar series. This is the sixth webinar that we've done. We've tried to do these around once a month. You can find previous episodes of the series on our YouTube channel, or they're also accessible via the Just Culture Consulting website. I'm Dr. 𝗿𝗶𝘶𝗶, the founder and principal consultant of Just Culture Consulting. We help high-risk industries with Just Culture implementation to transform safety reporting into competitive advantage. These webinars are all about getting some information around various aspects of Just Culture, safety management, human factors. It's an opportunity for people to ask any questions around Just Culture or those related topics, from the very basic to the very advanced. This session today, we're going to be talking about retraining. Why it is so often the default fix after an incident or an accident or where human error has been identified, and talking about, well, why, despite being the default, why it often actually fails, it's not effective. So the format for today, I will speak for around 20-25 minutes on this topic. I'll talk about why retraining appears so frequently in investigation findings, what it assumes about the causes of human error, when retraining actually is an effective response. But then I'll look at alternative responses where actually retraining is not necessarily that helpful, and where the issue lies more in system design, in pressures or conditions of work. And then we'll do a Q&A for 5 to 10 minutes or so at the end. But please do feel free to post any questions that you might have in the chat as we go through, and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as we go and answer those either as we go or at the end. Before we get started, if you have any suggestions or things that you would like us to cover on future webinars, please also put those in the chat. You can also go to, after the webinar, go to www.justculture.com.au/ask-questions. And there's a form there that you can fill out. And you can also put any other Just Culture related questions in there. We do look at all of those, and we will answer. So yes, please do feel free to avail yourselves of that. Now, in this webinar today, I'm going to be talking a lot about human error and different types of human error. And that may be controversial for some. Like, there is a bit of a debate going on in the safety sphere around whether human error is an appropriate category or an appropriate term. It's a debate that I'll sort of park for another day. It's when I'm talking about human error for the purposes of today's webinar, I'm really going to be defining it as where the actions or the results of something that of a human are unintended by the organization. So there's no real sort of moral judgment there. You know, the outcome of what the person did may be good, it might be bad, but simply that it was something that was unintended by the organization as part of their normal work. And so I think it's a useful framing for the purposes of this discussion in terms of when retraining is or isn't going to be an effective response. So let's get into the material. And I'll talk firstly about, well, why does retraining appear so frequently as an outcome in investigation findings? I think the first thing is to say that training in general is unfortunately often underinvested within organizations. When there are cost pressures, the training budget is usually one of the first things that gets cut. And often training is not done in a particularly effective way in many organizations, particularly when it comes to safety related training. Very often it's generic rather than job specific. It's often, unfortunately, death by PowerPoint, and so it can be quite theoretical and not particularly practical. It's often untracked, where there's not good record keeping about who's been trained in what and when, and very, very often, particularly in smaller organizations, it's unassured in the sense that there's no real monitoring of, is the training actually effective? And so given those characteristics, it's not surprising necessarily that issues with training and corrective actions for retraining would appear so frequently in investigation reports. Another reason is when you have investigations that have their final conclusion in human error. If the investigation report is, oh, this person got run over by a forklift because the forklift driver did not follow the procedures, human error, they need to be retrained. And if the investigation stops at human error, then a natural response to that is going to be retraining. However, if we go beyond human error, if we start in our investigations looking at, well, why did that error occur? Then actually what we'll find quite often is that retraining is not going to be an effective response. Sometimes it will, but sometimes it won't. Retraining is also easy to recommend in an investigation report. It's easy to recommend retraining. It, like I say, it flows naturally from a finding of human error, and it's easy to close out as a corrective action. Right, retraining required, the retraining was done, signed off, boom, done. It makes it very simple and easy, and so it's often the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, it's also often convenient to recommend retraining. It means that it is the individual who is the problem. They need to be retrained. It focuses on them, and it's not focusing on the organization or the supervision or leadership. And so there's often regulatory or political convenience to say it's the individual is the problem rather than problems in the organizational systems that gave rise to this incident or this error. And so that's something that is unfortunate, but something that we have to be aware of as a tendency within organizations, and something that we often have to push back against and try and encourage actually that self-reflection on the behalf of the organization. When it comes to retraining, and like what does retraining assume about the causes of human error? If our default response is retraining, then our assumption is that the human error must be a product of insufficient knowledge or skill or effort. And therefore we can do additional training and we can fill that knowledge gap, that skill gap, or that effort. And that may often be the case. But as we'll see as we go through different types of human error, it's not always the case. And so this assumption that we bring to it is really a narrow assumption about the causes of human error. We're also implicitly assuming that that avoiding the error was possible, when, as we'll see, sometimes given the practicalities of the work, maybe actually it wasn't. It assumes that avoiding the error was the thing that made sense at the time. And again, as we'll see as we go through some of these categories of human error, sometimes when maybe the thing that actually made sense at the time was to make an error, or in this case, to do something which the organization did not intend when it designed its systems of work. It also assumes that intentional non-compliance with rules is due to insufficient knowledge or skill or effort. The person could comply with the rules if they tried hard enough. If they have a good enough understanding about why the rules are there, that they will therefore comply with them. And that assumption may not necessarily always be true. So, having said all that, when is training actually the right response, an effective response to human error? I think the first category would be what is often called intentional mistakes. So what do I mean by that? So when I say intentional, in this instance, I mean the action that the person took or the decision that they made was intentional, not that the mistake itself was intentional. So the mistake part then is thinking that we are doing the correct thing when we actually are not. And these can often come from two primary sources. One is rule-based. So so an example of that might be, I believe that an order qualifies for free delivery, when in fact it doesn't. So I've given free delivery thinking that I'm following the rules. So I'm intending to give free delivery, but I'm not intending the mistake because I believe what I'm doing is correct. But in actual fact, I'm wrong. The rule that I've gotten the rules wrong. It may also be knowledge-based. So, for example, let's say that there's a rule saying we have procedures against placing combustible chemicals near an ignition source. And I understand that rule. I know the rule, but I place a chemical near that combustion source, and I don't realize that that chemical is actually combustible. That's a knowledge gap on my part. Again, I believe I'm following the rule, and I have interpreted the rule correctly, but my knowledge, there's a gap there. I don't realize that what I'm actually doing is breaking the rules. So in these kind of instances, training is going to be an effective response to address those knowledge gaps. And it's a necessary response to prevent or to minimize mistakes. So obviously the most clear-cut example of when training is required is when staff are learning new things. So they're learning new tasks, new procedures, equipment, etc. It might be because they're new employees to the organization. It might be because the organization is doing something new. So obviously, clearly training is appropriate in those situations to close out those knowledge gaps. It's also appropriate where you have experienced staff where you've identified a knowledge gap. So perhaps someone was on leave when a procedure changed. They've then undertaken the task believing that they're following the procedure, but because they were away, they don't realize it's changed. And so there's a gap in their knowledge. And obviously their retraining will assist in filling that knowledge gap. You may want to consider refresher training for uncommon but high impact tasks, because these are the kinds of areas where people's knowledge of the procedure or their background knowledge may fade over time because those tasks are not being conducted in a regular way. So emergency drills would be a very prime example of that. But refresher training is really important because hopefully you're not engaging in emergencies on a regular basis. One important tip with that is, as far as possible, to make that refresher training practical. So to actually do those tasks as close to the real thing as you can. Not just say a PowerPoint illustration. So give an example of, say, using a fire extinguisher. A much more effective training is going to be people handling a fire extinguisher, being able to feel and experience what it's like to use one, rather than being given a PowerPoint presentation about how to operate a fire extinguisher, but they've never actually touched one in real life. Another tip that I want to give when it comes to training or retraining is that whole sign that you've read and understood at the end of training. I would suggest it's of limited value. Sometimes organizations do it for what they think is a legal liability standpoint. And yes, it shows that the person attended training, but it doesn't show that training was actually effective. And the fact that they've signed something saying that they've understood it is really of limited value. If there is an incident, the ability of the organization to rely on that as a defense is pretty limited. And when you compare that to the negative of the fact that this kind of sign that you've read and understood can often feel punitive or feel like a lack of trust by the organization in their staff. And that has some negative consequences for engagement. So if that is something that your organization does do, that whole read and understood thing, you might want to consider what value you're actually getting from that, and whether that's actually worth doing. What I would suggest is that safety assurance from training really comes from things like observing people doing the task, or by asking them to explain how they would do the task. Those are much more effective demonstrations of the effectiveness of training than just simply signing off that they've read and understood. Perhaps asking them after training, given this training, do you feel confident performing the task? And if you ask that in a environment where saying no is okay, and the response being, oh, no worries, let's go over all any things that you're not sure about. Again, that is a much more effective assurance mechanism when it comes to effectiveness of training. All right, what about where training is perhaps not going to be an effective response? Let's look at alternative responses where the issues really lie in system design, pressures, or conditions of work. The first is unintended errors. So this is where the action that the person took was unintended. So the first example of that is a slip. So a slip is where I intend to do one thing, but I accidentally do another. So let's say I'm operating a crane and I'm intending to press the up button on the crane controls, and I accidentally press the down button instead. And this is most common with untrained or inexperienced people doing a task. And so clearly, obviously, training would be effective in terms of learning that task in the first place. But slips often arise with trained and experienced people as well, particularly where they're performing a task that they do regularly or are very familiar with. And these kind of slips will occur from time to time. And that's what makes it difficult at times, because someone might be doing that task correctly 99% of the time, but then every now and then they'll slip. But they'll do something, they'll take an action that they didn't intend. The next type is a lapse. And lapses are errors of memory. So perhaps I forget to close a fridge door. Obviously, those kinds of memory lapses are most common when people are busy, under stress, where there's time pressure, and things like that. And for both slips and lapses, particularly when you're talking about experienced people, training is going to be of limited value, because the person knew what they had to do. Them knowing what to do was not the problem. Nevertheless, unfortunately, I often do see frequently retraining prescribed in those kind of situations. I had a situation where retraining was recommended, where an employee was walking across an airport apron and they literally tripped over their own feet. And the corrective action was retraining, which was baffling to me. I mean, what, you want me to retrain them in how to walk? It's incredible, but you do see that kind of corrective action sometimes. Clearly, obviously, retraining is not going to be effective for something like that. So when it comes to slips and lapses, particularly with experienced people, what is going to be more effective? It really comes down to system design, designing systems of work that minimize the potential for these kinds of errors to happen, or to have mitigations in place to reduce the impact if they do. So these can be things like guards on critical buttons to prevent them from being pressed accidentally, consistency in types of equipment. So if I'm working with two different types of crane, with two different types of control panels, the chance for my muscle memory to kick in and hit the wrong button is increased. So consistency reduces the risk of that happening. Cross checks and checklists can help to prevent memory lapses from leading to errors, or interconnectors. Things like where I can't turn the machine on until the guard is down, and things like that. The next type of error that is where training is not really that effective is intended errors. This is where the action is intended and the error, in terms of the unintended action from the organization's point of view, was intended. So these are things like sometimes called workarounds or deviations or adaptions or violations or variations. Basically, it's deliberately going outside the rules. Sometimes these can be due to exceptional circumstances. So I go outside the rules due to an exceptional circumstance, usually to help the organization achieve its goals. And this often occurs when the rules are impossible or impractical to follow because of the exceptional circumstance, or because they conflict with other organizational priorities, such as efficiency. So, for example, a pilot departs on a flight knowing that they will arrive 5 minutes later than cut off for their fatigue rules. So they're going to be outside of the fatigue rules. But they think, for the sake of 5 minutes, if I cancel the flight, then the organization would have to front up for accommodation for all the passengers. The aircraft would be out of position for the next day's flying. For the sake of 5 minutes, I may as well do the flight. And they're doing so to try and help the organization achieve its goals, but they're breaking the rules in order to do it. Another scenario is a routine workaround, where going outside a particular rule has become the norm among staff, and managers are either unaware of it or they're aware of it and they're not enforcing it. So, for example, you might say have laxer standards on the night shift because people want to go home early and no one wants to be the person who is holding things up. And supervisors, perhaps they want to get home early as well, and they turn a blind eye to it. Another tip: this kind of situation can lead to major liability issues. A CEO in New Zealand recently was found guilty of work health and safety breaches out of this kind of situation where working around the rules had become normalized, and the safety systems in the organization was not picking it up. I'll probably talk about that particular case in a future webinar. But again, training is of limited use in these situations. The people involved, they know what the rule is, they know what the requirements are, they've chosen a workaround. So a far more effective result than retraining is to be curious, to investigate and address the underlying causes. Or why did it make sense at the time to work around the rule? And understanding that is going to be critical to crafting your response. And you want to be open to either addressing the underlying cause to remove the need or the ability for the workaround. So that might be changing the work schedule, put a bit more fat in the schedule, for example. Or alternatively, to be open to changing the rule to reflect operational reality. So maybe the way that the workers are doing it is actually a better way of going about it than what the procedure is laid down, and we can risk assess it and then change the procedure to actually reflect that improvement. But again, it requires curiosity and crafting our response based on what are the underlying causes of that workaround. The final kind then is a malicious or personal workaround. So that's deliberately going outside the rules, intending to cause harm or damage, or for personal gain to the detriment of the organization. So this is sort of thing around, say, stealing cash from the till, or a supervisor rostering a staff member on all the worst shifts because they don't like them. And this can arise for a variety of reasons, including greed, desperation, some sort of justified or otherwise sense of grievance or entitlement. It's often associated with lack of engagement or investment in their work. And again, training is of limited use here because people know the behavioral expectations and are deliberately going outside of that. Then really, it's not a matter of training here. A disciplinary action is appropriate both to protect the organization and to maintain the morale of other staff members who are not engaging in that behavior or who have been a victim of it. So you can see that depending on what the type of human error is, training there is going to have a big impact on whether retraining is going to be an effective response. Now, it's important to note that, of course, in the real world, that errors rarely fit into a nice little box. Many have shades of more than one. And so it's really important to be curious and to exercise judgment in particular cases, and be a bit discerning, but to be consistent, to treat like for like and take a principled approach. I've set a lot of what we talked about today in a handout around how to respond effectively and fairly, different kinds of types of human error. You can find that on the Just Culture Consulting website in the resources section. So that covers a lot of what I've spoken about today. All right, so that's all the material that I had. I'll spend the last sort of 5 minutes or so on any questions that people might have. So please post any questions in the chat. I do see that we have one question here from LinkedIn. How do you resolve sending a mixed message when you don't retrain or discipline after an error, but people expect something to happen? Yeah. So that whole expectations thing, I think, first off, you want to have a framework for addressing human error, whether you call it a just culture policy or a just culture framework or something else. But you want to have a framework in the organization that allows you to take a principle-based approach, and you want to make sure people are trained in it so they know what to expect. So these things are not a surprise. The other is if you're not going to be disciplining, if you're not going to be doing retraining, it's really important to explain what, in fact, you are doing. So if, for example, you've identified that actually the system of work has given rise to this error, perhaps by, it's the procedure requires use of particular equipment, and the equipment was not available, then to look at to explain what we are doing. Okay, well, we are making sure that we've got more equipment so that this situation where the equipment is not available does not arise in future. So explaining what you are doing is really, really important. And it's also obviously very good for building up that safety culture and that safety engagement, when people see that you are not just looking at individuals, but you're looking at the overall system and how the system is working. Another question here. How do you distinguish in practice between a knowledge-based mistake and a slip or a lapse when investigating an incident? Yeah, so as I said before, the answer may not fit nicely into a box. Circumstances will often sort of overlap from one to another. So you want to be flexible and not just apply this framework in a rigid kind of a way. Obviously, the first thing to do is to ask the person to talk through what happened and how and why it happened, and that will obviously be your main source of understanding about what was going on, whether there was a knowledge gap, whether what they did was intended or not. You might need to review training records in that sort of instance to see, to help you identify knowledge gaps. Oh, this person missed out on this particular training or something like that. But talking to the person and understanding what made sense at the time as far as what they were doing or what they were intending to do is your main source of information there. Have we got any other questions? Another one. How do you balance consistency with case-by-case judgment when similar errors occur in different operational contexts? Yeah, a really good question. What I would say is you need to take a principle-based approach. So obviously every factual situation that you run into, every error, every incident is going to be different. But what you can do is apply consistent principles and explaining the principles that you are applying. And so so that's how you achieve consistency, is to say, this is the situation, this is what we've understood has occurred in this particular situation, and this is the principle that we are applying to it. And so that's so taking that kind of principle-based approach will help you to build consistency, particularly when you might have to, and particularly explaining why you might be preferring one principle over another in a given circumstance. But I think that helps to achieve that. All right, we're pretty much up to time, but if anyone has got any last-minute questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. But just to close us off, thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar and the great questions that we've had so far. I hope you've found the material today useful. Our next webinar won't be until probably July, because I'll be traveling overseas for work for the next couple of months. But I will try and put out some pre-recorded video information on the different topics over the next couple of months. But be on the lookout in July for the next webinar. We'll promote that on the LinkedIn and on YouTube and on our website. Once again, if you do have any other questions that you'd like to ask around this topic or any other topics around Just Culture or active management, or if you have any suggestions for a future webinar, then please do go to the website www.justculture.com/askquestions, or if you just want to ask a specific Just Culture question, we'll look at all those and get back to you with an answer. There'll also be a QR code on the screen at the close of this webinar, so you can get the link there as well. All right, if there's any other questions, so we'll finish up there. Thank you very much again for joining. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and hope to see you next time.